Welcome to the Deep Dive, and a special hello to all you Stock Talk listeners tuning in.
Hey, everyone.
Today, we're doing what we do best, unpacking a stack of sources you shared with us. We're focusing squarely on the big market news, the earnings reports, and, those key economic data points that dropped for Friday, May 30th, 2025.
Yeah, we've got market wraps, news hits, company reports, the works.
And our mission really is simple. Cut through all that noise and pull out the absolute must-know insights just for you.
And looking through this material today, wow, it's quite a mix. We've got everything from, tech giants dealing with antitrust suits and landing these massive government deals,
Right.
to how retailers are handling tariffs, the latest inflation numbers, what's happening in housing, even electric air taxis pop up,
Yeah.
and some global stuff too.
Okay, let's get into it then, starting with some of those big corporate headlines and strategic moves we saw on the sources.
Yeah, across this first batch of material, there's definitely a theme, isn't there? It's this complex interplay between tech innovation, government money, and regulatory pressure.
And that pressure is really front and center today with the Google antitrust case. Closing arguments are happening.
Yeah, this is a big one. The sources were talking about some potentially huge outcomes, like forced divestments. The government basically saying Google has to sell off parts of its business.
Seriously? Like what?
Well, some speculation even touched on Chrome, the browser. And then there's that huge, $20 billion deal with Apple.
The default search deal, yeah.
That could be on the chopping block, too.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this case, it's definitely a big signal for tech regulation overall.
Okay, but then you see the government swinging the other way. From regulation to, handing out massive contracts. Dell got a big one, according to the sources.
They certainly did. The Department of Energy picked Dell to build their next big AI supercomputer. And what's interesting is, yes, it uses NVIDIA chips, no surprise there.
Yeah.
But it also kind of signals a strategic shift, right?
Yeah.
The government embracing commercial AI tech at this really high level.
And the sources pointed out this is a major coup for Dell in a market usually dominated by HP, right?
Exactly. A big win for Dell.
And speaking of tech moving into government spaces, Meta's making moves in defense.
Yeah. The sources say they're teaming up with Anduril. They're looking to develop these AI-powered VR and AR combat headsets.
AR, virtual and augmented reality. For the Army?
For the U.S. Army, yeah. They're bidding on a $100 million contract. The material flagged this as Meta's biggest defense play mentioned so far.
And sticking with government contracts, Palantir's footprint just keeps growing under the current administration.
Oh, yeah. Palantir's federal deals, especially with some key agencies, have ballooned to over $900 million now.
Wow.
And the sources noted their stock performance reflects that shares up, 140% since Trump's election?
That's significant.
It is. And, just to be balanced, the material did mention a concern raised by some observers about the potential for consolidating too much data on U.S. citizens with these huge contracts. The sources just reported that concern, didn't analyze it further.
Understood. Okay, shifting slightly. Content and AI licensing. The New York Times made a move.
Yeah, they signed a multi-year deal with Amazon, basically letting Amazon use decades of Times journalism to train its AI models.
Interesting. That feels like a shift, doesn't it? Didn't they sue OpenAI and Microsoft over this exact thing?
They did back in 2023. So yeah, this signals maybe a strategic pivot towards licensing that content as a way to, monetize it in the AI era.
Okay, let's look internationally now. Geopolitics impacting business. Boeing seems to be getting back on track in China.
Looks like it. The sources say they're restarting jet deliveries there next month.
That's huge for them.
It really is. And there's talk this could let Boeing ramp up 737 MAX production, maybe hit 47 a month by year end. That's a key number everyone watches.
Yeah.
The CEO is also quoted kind of downplaying tariff impacts on their business specifically.
But on the other side of that trade tension coin, Synopsys, big reaction to China restrictions.
Yeah. Synopsys, they make crucial chip design software. They just halted all sales and services in China. Pulled their forecasts, too.
Why this sudden stop?
Because new U.S. export rules targeting exactly their kind of tech just kicked in. So it's a really direct hit from those geopolitical tensions. Shows the real-world impact.
And quickly on consolidation, EOG Resources is buying up assets.
Yep, acquiring Encino Acquisition Partners for $5.6 billion. This is all about bulking up their Ohio shale holdings, adding about 675,000 acres, positioning for future energy production there.
Got it. And one more quick hit on new tech, Joby Aviation. The electric air taxi folks saw a big stock jump.
A huge jump. Up 29% on Wednesday. The trigger was getting a $250 million payment from Toyota.
Ah, Toyota's involved.
deeply. It's part of a bigger $500 million investment Toyota's making to help Joby get through the certification process, which is critical, and actually start producing these electric air taxis. So a major vote of confidence from a big partner.
Okay, quite a few strategic moves there. Let's pivot now, like you said, and dive into some recent earnings reports, see what they tell us about how companies are actually performing, especially in retail. And Dell actually connects back, right? Their earnings came out too.
They did. And it's a classic example of looking beyond the headline numbers. Dell actually missed Q1 EPS estimate, slightly came in at $1.55, but revenue beat $23.38 billion.
EPS being earnings per share.
Right, key profitability metric. But the kicker, and probably why the stock ticked up, was the forward look. They jacked up their full-year EPS outlook significantly to $9.40.
Why the big jump?
Citing surging demand specifically for their AI servers. Connects right back to that supercomputer win, right? And they forecast Q2 revenue way higher than Q1, like $28.5 to $29.5 billion, plus big shareholder returns.
So the takeaway is future AI potential is trumping a small current quarter miss for investors.
Seems like it. That's the story the market's buying right now for Dell anyway.
Okay, let's look at retail then. The sources gave us a few snapshots. Costco first.
Costco looked pretty solid. Beat Q3 estimates on both EPS 4.28 and revenue $63.21 billion. Sales up a decent 8%, e-commerce growing strong at 16%.
And they're managing those tariffs we keep hearing about.
Yeah, the sources noted they used tactics like shipping early, rerouting, some selective price bumps to manage costs. Interestingly, though, their shares dipped slightly pre-market despite the beats. Maybe expectations were just that high, or is broader market jitters?
Gap sounded more like a mixed bag, especially on tariffs.
Definitely mixed. They beat Q1 EPS, $2.51, and revenue, $3.46. But they put out a pretty stark warning. Tariffs could whack them for up to $150 million this year, even with their efforts to soften the blow.
Ouch, and the stock reacted.
Plunged 16% pre-market. Not really on the Q1 numbers themselves, but because their guidance on gross margins, basically, future profitability on sales missed what people expected, largely because of those tariff fears.
Okay, and American Eagle. Sounds like they had a rougher time.
Yeah, a tough quarter reported. They actually posted a loss of $0.29 per share in Q1, missing estimates. The big reason cited was a $75 million write-down on merchandise.
A write-down, meaning inventory they couldn't sell.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Writing off inventory value really hits the bottom line. And they gave weak guidance for Q2, too, blaming both tariffs and what they called merchandising missteps. The sources mentioned the stock's down like 33% year-to-date.
Yikes. But Shoe Carnival bucked the trend. Positive reaction despite an investment cost.
This one was interesting. They kept their full-year 2025 guidance steady, even though they said, hey, we're going to take a $1.65 per share hit to earnings because we're investing $25 million to grow our Sioux Station brand.
For a market like that.
Apparently. Shares shot up 11% pre-market. Seems investors are betting the long-term growth from expanding that premium banner is worth taking a short-term earnings hit for. Bit counterintuitive, maybe.
Yeah. And the sources also just quickly mentioned a few other tech cloud names, Marvell, Zscaler, NetApp, all apparently beat on revenue and EPS too. So a bit more positive data from that sector.
Right, adds a bit more texture to the overall earnings picture from today's material.
Okay, let's zoom out from specific companies now and look at the wider economy. Some important data points came through in the sources. Inflation, obviously, is always key.
Always. And we got an update on the PCE Price Index personal consumption expenditures. That's the one the Fed really watches closely when they think about interest rates.
How news was?
Pretty good, actually. It fell to 2.1% last month, which is below the 2.2% forecast. And core PCE, which strips out food and energy, was 2.5% annually, also a tick below the 2.6% forecast.
So inflation continues to cool down a bit.
That's what this data suggests, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is definitely something the Fed wants to see as they consider, their next moves.
We also got a revision to Q1 GDP, gross domestic product.
Yep, the final look at Q1 growth, or slight contraction in this case. It was revised to MASIC 0.2%, so down 0.2%. That's actually slightly better than the first estimate of MASIC 0.3%.
Okay, slightly better, but still negative.
Still negative. And the concerning detail the sources highlighted was that consumer spending and private demand figures within that GDP number were revised lower.
And the reason given?
Partly attributed, again, to tariff uncertainty. You see how that theme keeps popping up, affecting company guidance and broader economic numbers.
Yeah, it really does. Okay, housing market. The sources had a pretty striking statistic there.
They really did. As of April, nearly 500,000 more homes listed for sale in the U.S. than there were active buyers. 500,000 more sellers than buyers.
Wow, that's a huge imbalance.
It's the widest gap they've seen since 2013. It just paints a picture of a stalled market, right? Sellers may be hesitant to give up low mortgage rates, buyers balking at current rates near 7%, plus general economic uncertainty. It's cooling demand.
Makes sense. Let's hop overseas quickly. India's economy looks strong in the reports.
Very strong. Grew 7.4% in their first quarter of 2025. Beat the forecasts. Strongest quarter of their fiscal year.
And that's despite trade tensions.
Yeah. Full-year growth hit 6.5%, even with those ongoing tariff issues, including with the U.S. It shows some real underlying strength in their domestic economy.
Okay. And lastly, just a quick mention from the sources about IPOs, new companies hitting the market today, May 30th.
Just a couple noted. Titanium Limited PTNM, that's a Hong Kong cosmetics firm, trailing 12-month revenue around $9.6 million, with decent growth.
Okay. And the other?
Fuxing China Group, FFFZ, Chinese zipper maker. Bigger revenue, about $109 million trailing 12 months, but actually saw a slight dip year over year, down just under 2%.
Always interesting to see who's testing the IPO waters.
Gives you a little pulse check. Yeah.
All right, and that pretty much wraps up our deep dive through today's stack of sources. We went from Google's antitrust trial and Dell's supercomputer win
to Meta in defense, Palantir's growth, Boeing in China.
then hit retail earnings from Costco, Gap, AEO, Shoe Carnival.
Check the cooling PCE inflation, revised GDP, that striking housing gap.
Saw India's growth, and even glanced at those IPOs, all pulled directly from the material you provided.
A lot ground covered there, synthesized from those reports.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on, pulling all these threads together. We saw strong corporate wins, especially in AI. We saw signs inflation might be easing, which could sway the Fed. But we also heard persistent worries about tariffs, signs of slowing consumer spending, that stalled housing market, and ongoing regulatory actions.
It's a real mixed picture.
So the question for you is, which single piece of news or data point from everything we covered today do you think will actually have the biggest ripple effect on the market or maybe the wider economy in the next few months?
Definitely something to mull over as you process all this info.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive, especially our Stock Talk listeners. If you found this useful, a good shortcut to getting informed, please make sure you hit subscribe on the deep dive feed.
Yeah, don't miss the next one.
And give this deep dive a like if it helped you out. It lets us know what's valuable. And maybe share it with a friend or colleague who wants to get up to speed quickly on the day's key developments.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.